The science of evolutionary medicine is still a relatively new kid on the block. It's really only 25 years old. And it was arguably first put on the map by the publication in 1991 of a scientific paper with the slightly grandiose title of The Dawn of Darwinian Medicine, and a book a few years later titled Why We Get Sick, The New Science of Darwinian Medicine, both by the late George Williams and Randolph Nesse. Williams was one of the 20th century's greatest Darwinian theorists, and he'd been looking for a doctor to interact with. Nesse, a professor of psychiatry becoming ever more fascinated by evolutionary theory, wanted to team up with a respectable evolutionary theorist. They found each other and began applying evolutionary insights to understanding and explaining human health and disease. Today, the field of evolutionary medicine is burgeoning. It boasts several scientific journals and a handful of research centers devoted to it, including the Center for Evolutionary Medicine at Arizona State University, of which Randy Nesse is the director. And Nesse once coined the aphorism, medicine without evolution is like engineering without physics. And of course, he meant that it would be impossible to imagine aerospace engineers, for instance, successfully building and flying the Rosetta spacecraft to rendezvous with the comet 67P with no knowledge whatsoever of physics, or civil engineers building the Shard skyscraper without any explicit understanding of the concepts of moment and force balance, bending moments and shear stress. Similarly to him, it makes no sense for medicine not to be fundamentally informed and guided by evolutionary principles. But does this mean that evolution will always be in the background, producing the ultimate context to proximal problems that confront medics day in and day out in the operating room, doctor's surgery, or in intensive care? Or will an evolutionary approach to medicine have a much more explicit effect? Can it fundamentally change our understanding of disease? Can it even change the practice of medicine? Well, that's what we're here to debate tonight. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. We have Gillian Bentley, who's Professor of Medical Anthropology at Durham University and a Fellow of the Wilson Research Institute for Health and Well-Being. Gillian is particularly interested in the effects of early childhood environments on reproduction and health in later life, and the effects of obesity on later life health. Daniel Nettle is Professor of Behavioral Science and co-director of the Centre for Behaviour and Evolution at Newcastle University. He's conducted research on the evolutionary origins of mood disorders and the relationship between childhood psychosocial adversity and accelerated deterioration of health in later life. His books include Happiness, The Science Behind Your Smile. Randolph Nesse probably needs no further introduction, safe to say that he's one of the pioneers and leading thinkers in the field of evolutionary medicine, and his tireless promotion of the field has resulted in his receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Human Behaviour and Evolution Society. And finally, Mervyn Singer is Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at University College London. He's a world expert on multi-organ failure, sepsis and infection, and has argued that doctors habitually intervene too much in a misguided attempt to stave off multi-organ failure, which is a last gasp adaptive metabolic response to the overwhelming systemic inflammation that occurs in serious, life-threatening illness and massive injury. He was the first UK intensivist to be awarded senior investigator status by the National Institute for Health Research. Now, I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists to outline in 4 minutes flat their basic starting position on the main question: will evolutionary medicine fundamentally change our understanding of disease? And we'll then have a panel discussion lasting about 35 minutes, which we'll divide into 3 linked questions. How does evolutionary medicine change our thinking about disease? Which neglected areas of medicine will benefit most from adding an evolutionary perspective? And how should we create the future for evolutionary medicine? Should we lobby for big funding projects for evolutionary medicine? And should more medical students be obliged to study it as part of their med school curriculum? There'll then be plenty of time for questions and answers. So first off, and I'm sorry that it sounds a little bit like Beat the Clock, I'd like to invite Gillian Bentley to take just 4 minutes to outline her starting position.
Yeah. So thank you very much for inviting me to present here tonight. Thank you, Ulrich and LERN. It's really exciting to be here. So in 4 minutes, just to outline my position, I thought I would just do a quick background. I surveyed a few medical doctors who I happen to know to get some idea about how medical doctors think, because in order to outline the position of somebody who looks at pathologies from an evolutionary perspective, I think the comparison would be a good idea. So this is what I got from the medical doctors I surveyed. Like, how do they actually figure out what's wrong with a patient if they're not evolutionary, and what process do they go through? So the first thing that my little team that I surveyed said was they look at the appearance of the patient, and from that they can derive some knowledge. And then 2 stars here, case history. They said that was the most important thing out of all the things that they might do. And the third thing was the examination that they might undertake. In most cases they would do of the patient, and then the bunch of tests. And from this, doctors could actually reach a diagnosis. And I said, well, you know, what thought processes are you going through while you're doing this? They said there's a lot of things going around in the head, and all of them come from the knowledge that they've acquired as doctors from medical school, and also from, of course, all the books and the education they've been exposed to, their experience as medical doctors. So this is the process that they go through, but for the people that I surveyed, one thing was missing, and that is Darwin the doctor, evolutionary medicine. They acknowledged that. So what about evolutionary medicine? How do people who have an evolutionary biological background think? It goes back a long way. I mean, we could really go back, if you want, to origin of life. I've put up here, for example, mammalian evolution, legacies that we share with other animals that medical doctors wouldn't be thinking of, and just a few statistics. We share 98% of our genes with chimps, but how many of you here know that we share 60% of our genes with Drosophila, or fruit flies? So a lot in common with a lot of other organisms. And then, of course, you know, we're humans, so we have to look at human evolution. Things that make us stand out. We're bipedal, we have hands, we're migratory, we cross vast distances. We have a long lifespan, low fertility, we're highly social and intelligent, and we have culture. So there's all these kinds of things interacting with our genes that determine things like health, and also determine why, if I can borrow Randy's phrases, we're vulnerable to disease, because Randy's always talking about that. So on top of that as well, so we have this very long-term perspective that we can take that inform our ideas about various diseases. We have other things that are what we might call more proximate. So things for the individual, like early life development, an area that I work in, exposures to various things across the life course. For example, smoking. If you smoke during a long period of your life, you're going to be vulnerable to lung cancer and other bronchial diseases. There are things like gene-environment interactions that really can predispose us to specific diseases, and I don't think that's going on in medical doctors' heads necessarily when they're trying to diagnose an illness and what they're trying to think about. And then, of course, immediate exposures, and these are the things probably that the medical doctors that I surveyed are thinking about when they make their diagnosis. So hopefully from this you can see that the process by which an evolutionary thinker would come to diseases is very different. So what does that lead to then? It leads to a view of medicine that's holistic, that's contextualized, and also that is personalized. So I think evolutionary medicine holds huge promise for personalized medicine as well.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Could I now ask Daniel Nettle to
Thank you.
state his position in 4 minutes? Thank you.
So I think if we're going to ask the question, how relevant is evolution to medicine, it's quite important that we define what we mean by medicine first. And actually I think there are a number of different things we might mean. So firstly, we might mean clinical medicine, the actual interaction of an individual patient with an individual doctor. And so my answer to the question of will evolutionary thinking change that encounter, I think my answer would be not very much, really. I think if I go to a doctor, I don't care if they know whether I share 60% of my DNA with Drosophila or not, or that I have culture and technology. I just wanted to help me to tell them what's wrong. So in a direct sense, I would say probably not very much. The second thing we might take medicine to mean is biomedical science. the search for better cures for diseases that people already have. And there, I think my answer to whether evolution will revolutionize it would be perhaps in some cases, but perhaps not very generally. And I think the reason for that is that seeking cures for diseases that people already have is fundamentally about understanding mechanism. It's about understanding molecular pathways, by and large. And though evolutionary theory is very good at predicting that our bodies will go wrong, in some sense, for example, as we age, the evolutionary theory of aging tells us that, it doesn't really tell us how it will go wrong, and therefore what molecular tweaks you might want to do to fix it. Now, there may be some exceptions to this, but I would say, so for biomedical science, to some extent. But the third thing we might mean by medicine is actually the place where I think evolution does have a big role, and that's epidemiology and public health, the understanding of the distribution across individuals and populations of patterns of disease. And there, I think that evolution makes a fundamental contribution to understanding, just as Gillian has been saying, why, certain early life patterns or some patterns of, behavior across the life course might lead to particular types of ill health later in life. Now, this is really important because, in a sense, prevention becomes an increasingly important imperative as we increasingly suffer from non-communicable diseases, things like obesity, things like metabolic syndrome, the diseases of aging. Really where the action is understanding prevention. And in a sense, if we take the evolutionary perspective on where does ill health come from, then we might begin to say, well, how should societies and structures and early life better be designed so that people don't get so sick in the first place. So just to summarize, Randy's wonderful book is not called, it's called Why We Get Sick. It's not called How Can We Make Ourselves Get Better? And I think that's a very important distinction, and I would actually say that our big contribution as evolutionists is actually understanding why we get sick and how we might avoid getting so sick collectively and individually, rather than, I've got this wrong with me, please give me a pill for it. There you are. I've finished within 4 minutes.
You certainly have.
You could go on another minute easily.
Thank you, Daniel. And so, Randy, thank you.
So,
Is that the right starting slide?
not quite, but
Not quite.
how about let's start with this one.
There we go.
So, I'm awfully glad for the invitation to join you all. Great privilege to be here. I've had great time with the EHBEA meeting, and I'd like to thank the British Periodontal Society for making this trip possible for me, and Philip Ower, who has the foresight to bring evolution to the periodontists of the UK. And Ulrich has done a marvelous job, and no one's mentioned that Jeremy's book that he's just published about Darwin's body is the best book about evolutionary medicine that's been published in recent years, so get it. Someone should have said that already.
No product placement, please.
I will go on briefly to say, though, that the big challenge for our field is keeping enthusiasm within check. I look forward to the time where there's no such thing as evolutionary medicine, just like we no longer have embryological medicine or biochemical medicine or anatomical medicine. Those basic scientists are woven in to the field. For right now, however, we have this giant gap between evolution and medicine. It's really very much like this, two separate fields, very few overlaps. This is what we're trying to do, is provide evolutionary medicine at the intersection of the basic science of evolutionary biology and medicine. I keep trying to call it evolution and medicine. Nobody pays any attention. They call it evolutionary medicine. I've given in. It's 25 years since George insisted on the grand title. I'm glad he did. It was worthwhile. This is an article in Science recently pointing out that it's been a slow dawn of Darwinian medicine. But this is more encouraging. These are articles with evolutionary medicine, and that's still a few years old, increasing exponentially. We really are finally starting to get traction. These are the people who inspired it all, many of them Brits, as you'll note. George Williams, my friend and deceased collaborator in all of this. Ernst Mayr, also from the States. But John Maynard Smith was a huge inspiration. Certainly Bill Hamilton has inspired all of us, and especially Nico Tinbergen, who actually got George and me to ask the right question. That is, not just why individuals get sick and why people are different, but instead why all members of a species are vulnerable to a disease. Why do we all have an appendix? Why do we all have wisdom teeth? Why don't we have a wider birth canal? These are a fundamentally different class of questions. And let me tell you, it leads to all kinds of people speculating wildly and being very confident that they're right with their very first idea. And this is why I say a challenge for the field is to keep control of enthusiasm. Because if you tell doctors, I do evolutionary medicine, as I did once for the leader of possibly the most wealthy funding agency for medical research in the UK, his response was, we don't need any evolutionary medicine. We've got enough alternative medicine. And he'd never heard anything about it. We need to educate people and have them realize this is very sober science, and we realize how difficult it is. And especially for those of us who are kind of doing evolutionary medicine, do it slowly. Peto's paradox is a good example. I think where it really hits rubber meets the road is specifics. Peto's paradox is that elephants don't have 10,000 times more cancer than mice, even though they have 10,000 times more cells. Why is it? Josh Schiffman and colleagues, a fellow who came to me after a lecture 15 years ago as an undergraduate, he's done research guessing that the elephants have more p53 genes than mice because p53 inhibits cancer. Guess what? They do. What a wonderful prediction with direct clinical implications in the long run, not immediately. This is Robert Dattenby's work with a new theory for a new scheme for doing cancer chemotherapy. And he's keeping mice alive much, much longer using evolutionary ideas. Why does the body make bilirubin? It's a great antioxidant, even though it causes jaundice and is toxic. Multiple sclerosis is vastly common in countries where there are no worms in guts. It's very uncommon in places where there are worms in guts. And amyloid beta has recently been discovered to be a fine antimicrobial. You'll soon be recognizing it not just as a toxin. This is the thing that causes, or said to cause, Alzheimer's disease. It's not necessarily a cause of Alzheimer's disease. It's more like the airbag that's gone off after you've had a car wreck. And finally, a simple study that Dan Kruger and I have done over the last several years. For every 100 women aged 20 who die in the UK this year, how many men will die? 300. For good evolutionary reasons. That's true for almost any species where the males compete for mates and invest more in competition. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. And now, Mervyn, for your 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invite. I've got a horrible cold at the moment. I've got a blocked nose, sore throat, bit of a temperature. Should I treat myself?
Oh, not really.
Exactly, because I know I'll feel better, but it will hang around for a few days longer if I treat myself, so I'd rather suffer. As you heard from Jeremy's introduction, I do critical care, which I suppose is the antithesis of evolutionary medicine. You know, I suppose we're the masters of the universe. You know, we have the machines, the drugs to make the numbers look normal. And when the patient dies, it's their fault. We did our best. We made the numbers look normal. But it's an interesting fact that in the last 20 or 30 years, trial upon trial upon trial has shown that doing less to the patient actually benefits them. Giving less blood, ventilating less hard, sedating less hard, feeding less hard, giving less fluid. And it was that dawning realization on me that made me think perhaps we've got our paradigm sort of all wrong. And when you think about it, we've had thousands of years to get to where we are today, and we've grown up with bugs, with parasites, we've grown up with disease. Well, actually, we live with our bugs and parasites in a healthy symbiosis. More of our cells are bacterial than human. Somebody told me the other day when we go to the toilet, we lose 10% of our body's cells. I'm not counting. But we've got used, we dealt with disease, with lack of food, with trauma. And all of a sudden, modern medicine comes along and disturbs that equilibrium. Perhaps sometimes to the benefit of the patient, so there is a trade-off. Some people who would have died in days gone by are now surviving. Perhaps we're not benefiting others who perhaps would have survived had we not interfered so much. So it's quite an interesting thought, and I think to paraphrase that man over there, and I hope I've got the quote right, it's not survival of the fittest or the strongest, but those who are best able to adapt. And it's interesting, more and more data is coming through to suggest that, you know, everyone who's ill for whatever reason, they have a signature, a biological signature of being unwell. But those who go on to die have a more extreme signature. And you can pick up that signature in the emergency department. So all I'm doing to those people is perhaps just prolonging their death, which is quite a sad thought, isn't it? The ones who should live, unless I screw up. The ones who are going to die, I'm just delaying the inevitable. So clearly, the message to me, we've got to recognize the fact, personalize our approach, help the people who would survive by perhaps doing the least possible that we can, whereas those who are predicted to die, we need to take a completely different approach because current medical paradigms aren't working. So there's a sort of quite a heretic view of medicine. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I would like to move on now to our panel discussion, which, as I said earlier, we're going to try and pick up 3 themes within that overarching question. And let's kick off. I'd like to open by asking Randy, really, how does evolutionary medicine really change our thinking about disease? In other words, we have Daniel here saying not at the level of very specific things, because evolution cannot address very specific things like mechanisms, molecular pathways. So in what sense does evolution, thinking about evolution, fit in to thinking about disease? Can it be very specific, or is this a general background way that we're informed about human beings and the way their bodies work?
I wish I disagreed more with Daniel, but I emphasize wherever I go that you should never, ever take an evolutionary theoretical principle and use it directly in the clinic. Because every time medicine has taken an abstract theory and applied it, whether it's Meshnikov or who knows, it's led to disaster. However, I also think that I've practiced medicine 20 years without evolutionary thinking as a foundation and 20 years with it. And let me tell you, it's not only more fun and feeling more understanding, and I think all doctors would appreciate an evolutionary perspective, it also in some ways allows me to make more subtle judgments. You start with the evidence-based guidelines. And then, why do we get outside education? Not just to follow the guidelines. It's because we're supposed to use our knowledge and our thinking to fine-tune those recommendations. And in particular, the one that's been the most for me is what's called the smoke detector principle. I never realized that natural selection shapes defensive regulation for cough, fever, nausea, pain, and all the rest. False alarms are normal in those systems because the false alarm is cheap, and not having an alarm when you need it was very expensive, and therefore the smoke detector principle predicts that normally you'll have many, many false alarms. This is how the general practice of medicine that blocks things doesn't kill more people. And doctors need to understand this for their everyday practice. I could say much, much more.
Well, perhaps we could sort of try and get to a specific example of where coming at a problem, a medical problem, a problem of disease, from an evolutionary perspective, really does change the landscape for you, if you like, of thinking about it.
If you'd allow me to give one more example, practicing as a psychiatrist, I've seen thousands of people with panic disorder. Suddenly, out of the blue, they have hearts.
Like that.
I'm going to create a panic attack right here, right now. Suddenly, their heart starts pounding, and they feel short of breath, and they have to leave the room. And I learned and was taught, first it was psychodynamic things, and it was behavioral things, and it was brain abnormalities. And I explained to my patients, no, it's not your heart, it's not your brain. It's a psychiatric brain disorder. And almost all of them said, thank you, Dr. Nesse. Do you know of a good cardiologist or good neurologist? I could never convince them. Then I realized it was actually a fight-flight response from my evolutionary thinking, and that false alarms in the system were normal. And I started telling my patients, actually, what you're experiencing is useful if there was a lion chasing you. What you're having is a false alarm in that system. And instantly, about 1 out of 5 of my patients would say, oh, that makes sense. I don't need to see you anymore, thank you. The others needed treatment, but this really did transform how I treated that particular syndrome.
Okay, let's bring Daniel in on that. There's a prime example of where evolutionary thinking along evolutionary lines provided a very helpful context for thinking about a panic. But what I'm fascinated to try and get to is how explicit can evolutionary thought be in terms of moving us towards an appreciation of what a particular disease is?
Well, I think we need to probably distinguish between several things. I think in the case of psychiatry might be a slightly unusual case in that the centrality of the person's understanding of what's happening to them is very, very great. I mean, that's actually true of other fields of medicine as well. And I certainly agree that an evolutionary way of thinking about who we are and where our bodies come from it's generally useful. I think all educated people should have, it should be absolutely woven into how we think about ourselves, in all fields, not just medicine, in law too, and, psychology and all kinds of other things. So I absolutely wouldn't disagree with Randy at all. The question is, how does that move from being, it's part of the context in which you think about the world to really actually, changing the fundamental operations of seeing a patient, taking a case history, the things on your slide there. And there, I think that's probably an open question. I think in some cases perhaps more than others. But,
right. Gillian, can you come up with some thoughts on this line of where sort of thinking from an evolutionary perspective really does change the context in which you address a particular problem? Maybe it's autoimmune disease, maybe it's whatever, you know.
Well, one of the good examples that I can think of that's come up recently is how evolutionary thinking has really transformed the way that cancers are being treated. Because in earlier days, people didn't understand that, a tumor, for example, is highly heterogeneous, and that if you sample, one part of the tumor, you might have a very different kind of cellular picture, molecular picture, than another one. And understanding that, also understanding that treatments, drug treatments, chemotherapy, the reason why people start relapsing is because tumors behave in the same way as, bacteria. There's resistance to the treatment. And I think that bringing that kind of evolutionary understanding to cancer is going to transform the way that we treat that disease.
But these are very explicit ways in which evolutionary thought is bringing to bear on how we treat people with antibiotics, how we throw chemotherapy at them. And yet you seem to be not, well, I don't know whether it's reluctant, but sort of not terribly happy to suggest that there are these very explicit insights that can be immediately pressed into service, if you like.
No, I'm not at all unhappy about that. I'm actually excited by it, and I completely agree. I just think we shouldn't be naive in thinking that, all the problems will get solved just because we take an evolutionary perspective necessarily. I think there's also a sense in which, it doesn't matter where good ideas come from. Once you've had them, you then need to do the trials, you then need to have the guidelines, you then need to have the evidence base. And in a sense, where the idea came from then disappears. Right? However it was generated, it led to a good body of empirical work that led to alternative approaches. And so it's quite natural that, given that evolutionary theory is the basis, I would say the unifying basis of all biological science, it's quite natural that would be a source of a lot of our ideas. But when the particular oncologist is administering the particular treatment, evolutionary theory may not be in the forefront of their mind. It's been in the food chain that's led to where we are. I certainly agree.
Well, I would tend to think that it's high time it was at the forefront of their mind, and very soon will be. But it seems to me, and Randy produced that example of Bob Gattenby with his different approach to applying chemotherapy. These are very specific ways. I mean, and studying the evolution of cancer has completely revolutionized how we think about cancer, how we think, as Gillian said, about its heterogeneity. And this really has revolutionized a huge field of medicine. Now, I'm not suggesting medicine across the board, but there is a very large body of medicine that has been completely shaken up, I think, in evolutionary terms. And it will lead. Yeah, right. Mervyn, do you have any thoughts on
I'll use antibiotics as an example. So we have, I don't know if you've heard of the microbiome. So I mentioned we have lots of bugs in our mouth, on our skin, in our lungs, in our bowel. And as I mentioned earlier, we live quite happily with them. And there are thousands of species within our body which don't actually cause any harm. There's only about 20 that are the common pathogens that cause disease. And many of them, I don't know if you're aware, each and every one of you a biological weapon. You've got enough endotoxin, which is the cell wall, part of the cell wall of a gram-negative bug that could wipe out London on your own. And yet you're looking pretty healthy to me. So we come along with antibiotics and modern invention, and we wipe out the microbiome. And now there's increasing evidence how the body talks with the bugs. The bugs respond to stress. They become more virulent, more angry. The brain talks to the gut. And so there's more and more data coming through about how not only do we live symbiotically, but actually we benefit from having the bugs. And yet we come along and wipe them out to our detriment. So I'm not saying totally get rid of antibiotics. You know, that was the point that was made earlier. We shouldn't immediately abandon all of our, precepts that, well, antibiotics are bad. Appropriately, for the right duration of time, absolutely great. But I think the lessons we've learned, so there's a big panic at the moment about resistance, but I think it goes far deeper than that. And I think there's stuff coming through to show that antibiotics in themselves are not the great saviors they're portrayed to be.
Right, okay. But just coming back to you, Randy, it seems to me that there really are sufficient examples out there. We've mentioned cancer. We've hinted at antibiotic resistance, more than hinted about antibiotic resistance. We've certainly hinted about the microbiome and its relevance for allergy and stuff, and autoimmune diseases. Where does evolution provide a tool to get at a fresh and productive understanding of disease that is lacking without, where the approach of medicine is lacking without it?
So I just said the greatest advances we're seeing that are practical are about small things that evolve fast in tumors or in bacteria. And George Williams and I didn't emphasize those at all in our book, actually, and this was a big mistake. I mean, evolutionary medicine is much, much broader than our original vision of it. I think that's important to know. Very briefly about cancer, I want to say that when I was a resident and we were treating kids with Hodgkin's disease with one drug, and the professor said, we've got to save the other drugs in case this one fails. Many, many children died because we were not taking an explicitly evolutionary view and using triple drug therapy 10 or 15 years sooner. This is very serious. But you've asked this question about how does it really transform things? And I'm going to go back to this asking a new question thing that George Williams and I proposed. This new question, again, is why on earth aren't our coronary arteries wider? Why on earth can't our immune systems cope with things better? I think these are mostly of deep intellectual interest for starters. They do not lead to direct treatment changes, but they often do lead to new research ideas. New research ideas such as, I also treated all these young women who had diarrhea that couldn't be stopped. And the GI doctors would say, Dr. Nesse, I've tested her bowel for all the pathogens. There's no bad bacteria in there. It must be psychogenic. Please treat her with psychiatry. And I talked with these young women, and they were very distressed because they couldn't go anyplace or do anything. Now it's perfectly clear that every time these doctors had given them a new antibiotic, they had disrupted the microbiome further, and these women could now be cured of their probably C. difficile abnormalities by transplants of the microbiome. That's a very, very serious error as well. So it doesn't lead you to direct things in the clinic right now, except for the little examples I've given. But I think it really is transformative in its ability to make us think differently about why we are vulnerable to diseases and what kind of studies we can do.
Okay, thank you very much, Randy. Let's move on to the second of our sort of linked questions, which it develops very nicely from that, which is what sort of areas in medicine do you think will benefit most from an evolutionary perspective, where, as I intimated just a little earlier, there's been a neglect of bringing evolution into that area?
Well, I think that actually the best examples perhaps inevitably have already come up. I think oncology is one, and then the other is the whole issue around the microbiome, and which is actually implicated in disease in many, many ways. Antibiotics sort of relate to that, but in many other ways too. Those would be the most sort of visible examples. I don't know if you want to come with others.
Yes, Julian, yes.
I was thinking about this a lot on the train on the way up here, because you use this term neglected diseases, and we can mention the big ones, which we have already, but I think there are a few other things that we could think about. Myopathy, short-sightedness, which affects about 2 billion people on the planet. I'm a prime example of this. I've got glasses, and underneath that, I'm wearing contact lenses as well, but don't ask about that. But many of us here have this problem. There's a few articles, but not very many, written about how early life development might affect myopathy, and I think we could do a lot more research with this and solve problems, put Specsavers and all these other companies out of business. They wouldn't thank us for that. So I think myopathy is one. Another one, with all due respect to Randy and colleagues, is that mental health issues is the one area in evolutionary medicine that I've always hesitated to teach, because I feel like we don't really understand very well yet, what is affecting people's mental health. And a quarter of people in the UK, USA apparently have mental health illnesses. So I think we need to do more work on this. And then a third one is probably malaria. And again, evolutionary approaches are beginning to be used. Just an example, people are starting to introduce bed nets. It's being very effective. And now we're learning the mosquitoes are changing their behavior. Instead of biting people at night, they're beginning to bite them during the day when they're not got bed nets. So, I mean, things like that. Diseases, conditions. I mean, obviously, myopia is not a disease. But, I mean, conditions that affect the quality of life. If we can hit up some of these big issues, I think that would be amazing.
Mervyn, if I could come to you, because I think there was something we could develop a bit further earlier on. And it comes also from something Randy said, which is there's something about being informed about evolutionary theory. It may not be explicit. It may be sort of so far in there that it's just manifested in terms of the sort of the questions you ask. And it seemed to me the questions you were asking about intensive care were those sorts of questions. Randy and I have talked a lot about a simple question in the field of Alzheimer's disease, which is to say, hang on a minute, what's this stuff beta amyloid doing in the brain? Now, you may say, well, that's not evolution, but actually it's the sort of question an evolutionist would immediately pounce on and ask. And of course, once you ask that question, you've taken the lid off an awful lot of things. Can you think a little more about that?
No, I agree. I think, I suppose, neglected area. I'll talk about stress, if I may, because I think stress is a really interesting topic that's completely neglected in the sort of physical side of medicine. It's sort of, let's call the psychiatrist, and, give them some drug to quieten them down. But is that the right approach? There's work going back 100 years where physiologists were going, a famous one called Walter Cannon, went from the US to the trenches in World War I and looked at American young conscripts and found that they were getting physically ill because of emotional stress. And that work's been carried through by others, not huge numbers, but others, where they basically have expounded on the fact that, yes, you need a bit of stress. It's a good coping mechanism that's part and parcel of everyday living, part and parcel of dealing with illness. But then when that stress becomes too prolonged, you decompensate and you become distressed. And so now in modern medicine, we obviously have the physiological stress, illness that brings the patient in, to which we add psychological stress and pharmacological stress, because many of our drugs are stressful too. And I think an interesting paradigm concept is to actually de-stress the patient. There's a lovely study, for example, where they played slow movements of Mozart sonatas to critically ill patients. And they found that many of their stress hormones were significantly lower, and their anabolic hormones improved. So, in theory, therefore, the recovery process could be enhanced by Mozart.
And it seems to me there's no clear line between people who say evolutionary theory is only really useful in terms of, sort of describing, if you like, ultimate mechanisms of the way that human beings work, and those who say, no, this could be of help to doctors and nurses in the front line. Randy, what would you think? Is there a grey area where there are some examples of where evolutionary inspired ideas really can help at the front line of medicine, or are those better off? The things that doctors do, is that so proximate? Is that when faced with a dead or with a dying or really ill person?
So why do we try to teach doctors so many things? I mean, again, they could just follow instructions and learn the jargon and follow the instructions. But we don't want doctors like that, because we want people who have a deeper understanding of disease. We even insist, in the States at least, that they learn calculus, matrix algebra, and quantum mechanics. Not directly relevant to the clinic every day, but we want people who have this kind of understanding of the world and mathematics and chemistry and all, because we think they make better decisions. The fact that they don't have a basic understanding of evolutionary biology is just I think we can't do our job on this panel trying to actually predict what's going to happen, because it's a wide open field that has not been plowed or sown yet. It's just ripe for people to be doing things. If you might, my specific suggestion comes back to my field of psychiatry. You know, a lot of the reason I went into the museum at the University of Michigan and started hanging out with George Williams was because I was frustrated. I didn't want to just do behavioral work or psychodynamic work or giving drugs or doing neuroscience. It seemed to me there had to be some basic science of behavior, and lo and behold, there's a huge behavioral ecology science of behavior, which many of people in this room appreciate and know, and nobody in psychiatry knows about it. Psychiatrists aren't taught it. And here's a simple principle from basic behavioral biology. Natural selection does not shape us for maximizing health, happiness, or longevity. Any allele that increases your fitness by that number of offspring is going to spread. My goodness sakes, this really in a disturbing way changes your view of what the body is and what behavior is. Everybody who treats patients should understand that, and not in the 2-minute version I just gave you. It takes a couple of hours to get that idea nuanced.
Mervyn, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I did. I totally agree with what Randy was saying. I think the problem now, I think there's been such an explosion of medical knowledge that medical students of today, junior doctors of today, are being increasingly sort of homogenized in the way they consider disease, consider the way they treat patients. So it's very algorithmic, which is actually quite depressing, because the algorithms are there to suit populations, not individuals. And I think we need that sea change. I think evolutionary medicine makes you think differently and tries to adapt. And I think that's the failing of where modern medicine is going. There's I had a lovely analogy on the radio a few days ago. Apparently there are 9 economic theories, but now only one's taught. And the worry is that, you know, and economic history is now not being taught in universities. So we can't look back at the disasters of the past and learn how we got out of it, because everything's being homogenized in economics, and there's a bit of an uproar, a sort of a revolt from a minority, but a vocal minority within economics, and hopefully medicine can do the same.
Gillian, can we just come back to you and thinking about an area that you're quite interested in also, and Daniel for that matter, which is things like allergy and autoimmune disease, microbiota research. There seems to be a problem, although the fundamental theory seems extremely sound and interesting and has a deep evolutionary dimension, there seems to be a problem, and it is taking time, seeing it successfully translated into medicine. Have you any thoughts about that?
Well, in terms of microbiome, I think it's getting quite a lot of press recently, so I think it is creeping in. But in relation to things like early life development and sort of how you affect treatments in general, I just want to take up something that Daniel said in the beginning. I think in terms of evolutionary approaches to, say, public health, not just necessarily medicine, it isn't just about treatment, it's about prevention. And the microbiome ties into this, you know, how we treat kids when they're young. I think we need evolutionary approaches in very young children, so that's like in the school environment. I think we need to hit kids when they're young to affect things like obesity and no, not literally. We need to
That's a theory I've not come across.
No, we need to reach children when they're young, and sort of take our evolutionary knowledge about how we evolved to be an active species, for example, and bring that into our understanding of how we educate children. And there's all kinds of things in the evolution literature about how we have to educate our immune system, as in the microbiota. We have to educate the way our skeleton grows by making kids active. We have to educate, you know, our metabolism so that we don't end up being overweight and obese. And I think we have to take that knowledge and start, you know, bringing that into the school environment where we can reach lots of children. There's this wonderful school in Stirling in Scotland that everyone's talking about, where the headmistress makes kids run a mile every day, and schools are beginning to introduce this, and not one kid in that school is overweight or obese. So we need to take the principles that we know about early life, whether it's autoimmune, functional, or something else, and take those principles and apply them. And then we can prevent a lot of diseases.
Okay, so this is, again, the employment, if you like, of evolutionary insights in the public health arena.
Yes.
Which is
Absolutely, and I think that what evolutionary theory thinking gives you sort of for free is firstly this notion of costs. You can treat young children with antibiotics, but there might be these costs because we're organisms, we're systems. You can't treat one thing without kind of having knock-on effects on others. And there are many evolutionary examples of, if you do more of this, you'll end up doing less of that, or whatever. And so understanding the notion of costs and that there might be deferred costs is very, very natural to evolutionary thinking, and I think that's a very useful thing. The other thing is evolutionary thinking helps you understand about comorbidity. The sectors of the population who get certain diseases tend to get lots of others as well, right? So diseases don't operate in a completely isolated way. In fact, we know that, if you have low birth weight, if you have certain stresses in early life, this predisposes you not to any particular disease, but actually to a whole suite of problems later. And I think evolutionary thinking gives you a very organic way of thinking about that in terms of, what are the inputs, what's the organism doing, what are the costs of certain things in the long term. So I completely agree with Gillian that should be the foundational theory of public health, really, is understanding those kind of costs and those trade-offs.
Right. When I was talking a little earlier about translating evolutionary insights into frontline therapy, like, for instance, the treatment of autoimmune diseases and allergies, what I meant, in a sense, was the success with which the research and the clinical trials can actually develop that idea to the point at which it can be generally accepted that the idea is proven and a therapy can emerge from it. That it's not always an easy pathway.
Well, just to add, I think it's a widely acknowledged problem in medical research that many things don't translate. It's not just evolutionary things. There's a huge translational gap. Lots of very good ideas, get stuck various places for a long time, and I don't think that's unique to evolutionary perspectives. Maybe there's a particular resistance, on top of that, but I think the translational gap is a general problem, actually.
Right, okay. Well, look, let's move on to our third thing, because it follows on very nicely from a point that Daniel made, and this is the idea of creating the future for evolutionary medicine. What does evolutionary medicine need to make it more generally taken more seriously, more widely? Does it need funding more strongly in a very explicit way? This is an evolutionary project, whatever. How do we help the field along in that sense? Gillian, can you?
Well, it is something of a problem. I think it depends what discipline you come from. I don't think it's hard for medical doctors who are in research necessarily to get funding, because in England they might apply to the Medical Research Council, or in the US, the National Institutes of Health. But if you sit between different domains, if you do work that has implications for clinical treatments, but you happen to be a biologist, or even worse, if you happen to be like me, a biological anthropologist, there are no sort of avenues of funding that are sort of specific to what we do. So in that sense, there's a gap. Collaborate with people maybe to get funding, but it would be nice to see at least one dedicated call from one funding agency for evolutionary medicine, and see what comes out of that.
Randy, you've done more than most proselytizing about this field. I mean, what does it need to gain more of a foothold? Is there, with respect to research funding bodies, still sort of not invented here? What are you talking about?
Indeed. A group of us approached one of the leaders of the National Institutes of Health in the States several years ago after a national evolution. And there's a synthesis center that's supported by the NSF. We'd worked for a year on how to get evolution into curriculum. We wrote them a note and said, we really need a funding panel. And we got a very polite note back from someone who perceived herself as a supporter, saying, we already support research on antibiotic resistance. We think we're doing our part. And so, and the problem is very simple, really. There are no, or very few, evolutionary biologists on these funding panels. There are almost no evolutionary biologists in medical schools to talk about curriculum. So whether it's seeking research funding or seeking, and you get things on funding panels, someone will just say, oh, it's all just so stories, or something that they read in the newspapers, as if that's a reason for turning things down, not even knowing the 8 different ways you can test a hypothesis. It really requires experts who have a sophisticated, subtle, deep body of knowledge about evolutionary theory and how you test these ideas. We've got to get real qualified evolutionary biologists into medical schools and into funding panels. And when we do, evolutionary biology itself will have new sources of funding and leverage, which will expand that field.
Daniel, you've said in your notes preparing for this and elsewhere that if an idea is good, it will get noticed and it will get funded.
Yeah.
And yet what Randy is suggesting is that there is a huge inbuilt inertia to getting a reasonably level playing field for these ideas.
Yes, I mean, I think I actually believe both of those things, if that's possible. I think that in the end, I'm an optimist. Right, the system does work. It works at glacial pace. Right? So, I think if we do our work well enough, and if we go and do great science, and we really think in a lot of detail about these ideas, and we will get there in the end. It's just it may take decades. I mean, we'd like it to be next year. I mean, I think that we've seen various moves that way. It's not going to be easy. So I think that the scientific process, the biomedical kind of research process, is ultimately an open system, and it can be made to do things it hasn't done before, but it just doesn't happen at the speed any of us would like. So I think both of these things are true. I personally think that in a way, I completely agree about medical funders being very sort of narrow-minded, but evolutionary biology funders are not. So actually, in a way, I think what evolutionary biologists need to do is apply to their evolutionary biology funders, saying...
So go to their own church.
Go to their own church, saying, but I'm taking the idea to deal with this problem. And then I have to hope, that ultimately it's an open system, you publish in good journals, people do see it, it's a slow process, it doesn't go as fast as you like, but, we will get somewhere.
Because we do have this inertia problem, Gillian, don't we, where you have, huge resources put into trying to develop the next race of antibiotics, sort of running like the Red Queen to stay still, and too little research into the dynamics, if you like, of antibiotic resistance and how we can actually develop strategies to reduce the problem. It's almost as if too often we're researching the wrong end of the stick.
Well, I think the problem there with antibiotics, as far as I understand it, is that most of the research has been done in pharmaceutical companies. It's hugely expensive, and they're not willing to invest the resources right now unless there's some promise of return. So I think it's a sort of economic problem. But one of the students who was on Durham's Evolutionary Medicine MSc last year wrote a really interesting paper about phage therapy, which I had never even heard of before, but which seems to be perhaps offering some, Mervyn's nodding away.
Well,
so
yeah,
maybe you can tell us
absolutely.
more about that as a potential new treatment.
I think basically to sort of continue from Gillian and Daniel's points, there actually is a move away from a sort of reductionist approach, because in the good old days it was let's look at one molecule, one pathway, and I think the realization's dawned that that's actually generated very little advance. As I heard from one funding panel recently, well, you get lots of nice Lancet papers, Nature papers, but it hasn't actually helped patients. And I was actually on an antimicrobial resistance panel for the MRC last week, and phage therapy was one of the things that was funded. So these, do you know about phages? They're viruses, essentially, that eat bugs. And they're in you, and they're in me. And they were from the US about 100 odd years ago, 150, and I think they're still quite heavily used in Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe. And the idea, well, let's try and do it and do the proper trials to see do they actually work. So, and I think there's also other really interesting approaches about social psychology which are being funded. It's how we change behavioural attitudes. So I think the wheel is turning. I think it's a sort of reasonably rapid evolution rather than revolution. But I think there is this realization. But I think you can't just throw a lot of money at a concept. I think Daniel's point, I think if it's a good hypothesis which can be tested, it will get funded.
Well, yes, but if I could ask a naive question of Randy, it seemed to me in a whole number of areas, and Gillian alluded to it, where you've got an entrenched industrial interest in seeing the problem one way. Take Alzheimer's disease. There was a great deal of work on the efficacy of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, which were shown to be preventive of Alzheimer's. If you look in cancer research, that miracle drug we call aspirin pops up again as being incredibly effective in actually stopping cancers developing and becoming more malignant. And there's something really fundamental about the way it works to stop these cancers developing malignant traits. And probiotics and autoimmune diseases and things like that. Too often, we spend $20 billion looking for, drugs to remove amyloid from the brain versus, something you can pick up at the chemist for a few bob, and it's a recurring theme. And how do we cope with the way that the dice are loaded like that?
So I'm skeptical that there are conspiracies holding back things, that companies are trying to inhibit things. But the simple way of the world, and it's not just in pharmaceutical companies, it's in the academy as well, is people will get jobs and funding in labs if people think that money's going to bring in money. And this is just why things are. When I came to Arizona State University, I told them, listen, don't you know that the National Institutes of Health is not quite ready to fund this yet? And they said, we know. Come do it anyway. And now, of course, they want me to bring in a lot of money. But, but I do think there are very good ideas that are going wanting. I'll give a very specific one. Andrew Reed, who ran the Malaria Research Unit in Edinburgh, thinks deeply and mathematically about antibiotic resistance. And he's been asking himself and others the question, should patients do what apparently evolutionary-minded doctors are saying and take all the antibiotics in the bottle? Will that actually prevent resistance? And after running the math and looking at a lot of examples and doing some experiments, he's concluded that that is probably the only recommendation that will not prevent resistance. You might take fewer drugs until you don't have a fever. You might take them longer. It depends on what the bug is, the nature of the bug, the blah, 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 blah. So he's tried very hard to get this funded and published and failed. He's brilliant, he's solid, and all the rest, but people don't get it. They think that mathematical models aren't real science and the like. This is tragic. I mean, we shouldn't be putting all of that $20 billion into developing new antibiotics. We should be trying to have new creative strategies for preventing resistance. I mean, I think there's just lots of examples like that. Again, no conspiracies, but the simple flow of money to things that are going to be profitable. Phages as well. We're in the midst of hiring new faculty for our center in Arizona, and I'm looking for someone who does phage therapy. And I've been told by experts in the area, you could try to do that, Randy, but hardly anyone is in that area, because actually to do phages, you have to get FDA approval, and it has to be customized for each individual patient. Because if you don't customize it for the patient, you won't get FDA approval, and no drug company will touch it, even though it's been shown to be effective. Interesting that a whole opportunity for a whole new approach to antibiotic resistance is just waiting for someone who has big pockets to fund it, to actually move it forward. Certainly not the drug companies. They don't see a profit.
Vladimir Putin, he's got a lot of money stashed away in various places. He could fund it.
That's sweet. Quick thought about education. And come to you, Gillian, because you're sort of an exception, really, at Durham, aren't you, in that you do have a specific master's course in evolutionary medicine, which I don't think there's very much else going on.
We're the only masters that I know of, so we're desperately trying to influence next generations of people, including intercalating medical students. But I think another approach, too, is, Mervyn and Randy are very unusual as clinicians in sort of embracing this whole idea about evolution. And, in a sense, we're reifying evolutionary medicine. So I agree with Randy. What would be nice is one day to not have this sort of separate identity. So what we need to do, I think, is sort of identify more people who are out there who are doing evolutionary work, but who either don't use the term or don't recognize that they are actually thinking in an evolutionary way. And I don't know what it will take to do that, just identifying people, drawing them into the fold, bringing them to our meetings. But I think if we can do that, then it will have a tremendous impact on.
I mean, as somebody who works very much at the sharp end of medicine, yes.
No, totally agree. It's the term isn't known, but the concept, I think people are subconsciously embracing. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just another couple of minutes then. Just like to invite you to pull out your crystal balls, and we'll start with Mervyn. I mean, if you were to look 5 or 10 years into the future, where do you think, not where you imagine, where do you think we're going to be seeing evolutionary inspired medicine thriving best?
I don't know about thriving best. I think we're just about to enter we are entering the era of personalised medicine. And I think it's a better idea of how an individual responds and reacts rather than one size fits all. And I think there's so many fields, my area, psychiatry, autoimmune disease, where I think at the moment we've homogenized care, and I think that's where the progress will be.
Randy, how about you? In 10 years' time, where would you
So when he said where, I thought Oxford, UCL, Arizona, and I'd just like to make a plea. I think the world's greatest concentration of expertise in evolution and medicine is at UCL. We don't have a medical school, or we are. You here at UCL have extraordinary people who are all ready to work together if they could each get 10 minutes off a week to actually talk with each other, and if someone in leadership position would actually call them all together and say, here are some extra resources. It wouldn't take much. I mean, UCL could be at least one of the 2 or 3 leading places in the world for less than the cost of a single new scanner. I mean, that's all it would take. If you wanted to do something intellectually, genuinely innovative, you're all ripe here and ready to go. But it takes some leadership.
Daniel, you're an expert. You've done a lot of work on disadvantaged childhoods and the long-lasting effects on health. I mean, in 10 years' time, could you see that, I mean, I'm talking about really applying what are evolutionary insights. And I mean, we're talking about social science here. We're talking about prevention. We're talking about public health. We're talking possibly about programs nationwide, worldwide for that matter, to do something about these sorts of trends. Can you imagine that these will become more concrete in time?
I can imagine it. You know, whether it will work out that way, I don't know. I think there's an increasing appreciation that your health in adulthood is not, doesn't come out of nowhere, and that issues like childhood obesity and childhood stress, for example, and its contribution to later life morbidity. It's an irony that this is a biological theory, but for me it actually ends up drawing a lot of attention to society and the way society is structured. Why are certain groups differentially exposed to food insecurity, psychosocial stress, and these kinds of things? So oddly, the more biologically you think about it, the more you end up actually worrying about these social determinants. And I see a potential alliance between the kind of Michael Marmot type people who've really brought the social determinants of health to the fore, and evolutionary biology, which possibly gives you a theory of why these social determinants are so important. And I do think there's an increasing ear in government for appreciation that fixing people when they go wrong is very expensive. But actually thinking about population health and the reasons, the way you might lessen the long-term burden of disease is ultimately where we need to be going.
Are you optimistic, Gillian?
I'm not sure I'm optimistic, not in these days of austerity, but I think it'll be a while before things change, but I'm on Daniel's side too. I think that we need to also have this marriage of social science and biology, and then we can really start to improve health for many, many people. Because I do think one of the problems as well, I mean, Mervyn's talked about personalized medicine, and I think that's very exciting and fantastic. But the trouble with that is that very likely a lot of money will be spent on very few. And the flip side of that is that we have so many people who need basic medical care. So I think we mustn't forget that at the same time.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, all 4 of the panelists.